Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Clarity in the Chaos as we attempt to bring some vertical clarity into the midst of our horizontal chaos. We live in a day when there is more information available than there ever has in history. And that information comes to us from all sources. You can find news from every angle. You can find information from every possible idea and perspective on any given situation. And that news is able to come to us in rapid fire mode. We have the latest up to the date or up to the moment information on our phones, our laptops, TV, whatever it might be that you use for your information source. And so it gets difficult sometimes to know, what do I believe? What do I hold to? That's one of the most common questions I get is, how do I know what to believe? There's so much information coming at us. I don't even know what is true. So many people in that moment, they shut down. They say, I don't know what to think anymore because there's so much information from so many diverse opinions and backgrounds that it's difficult to decide. It's for that reason that we must have God's perspective. We must have His perspective and wisdom, or we will get lost in the amount of information. As we come to Proverbs 14 today, we're looking for verses or single verses out of each of the chapters of Proverbs to give us wisdom, perspective, and hope. Today, we begin with a single verse from verse 15 in chapter 14, and it says, "The simple believes every word, but the prudent considers well his steps." There's a lot of words out there, and the Bible, specifically the book of Proverbs, calls us to be careful about hearing information and believing every word we hear. He starts here with a group that he calls the simple. He says there are those who believe, they trust in, they put great stock in, they lean into every word that they hear. Every story that they hear, they believe. And he says this group are those who are simple. It's a word for someone who's naive, who is inexperienced, who's easily convinced. And we are called to not be simple. We're called to walk away from that kind of immaturity and into a place of great wisdom. So he says there are those who they hear a story and they believe it. The first story they hear is the one they believe. And boy, there's so many stories that come at us, and they have great appeal to them. Sometimes they're more appealing because they have great passion with them. Someone comes to us and they are using lots of emotion and they are impassioned about what they are saying, and it can make it believable. But we have to be careful and not be simple. Just because it's impassioned does not mean that it's true. Some people believe a story because it has a suspicious angle to it. There's some intrigue to it, and there's a lot of buy-in from people. All of a sudden, if there's an element of conspiracy to it, for some people, that immediately hooks them. They buy into it without hearing the whole story, without knowing the counter story to it. Some people buy into a story because it's given to them in secret. It's given to them as a limited set of facts that no one else knows, and so they easily buy into it. Some people buy into a story because there's some bitterness to it. They tell their story because they've been hurt, and they tell how someone wounded them. And this causes buy-in from some people. They immediately jump on the train of how dare they, what do they think they were doing, without hearing the other side of the story. And some people buy into a story because it has a choose a side feel to it. It immediately presents two sides, and they want you to be on their side. And for some people, that becomes instant buy-in. This verse encourages us, warns us against being simple, Don't believe every word. Don't believe it just because it was the first story you heard. Don't believe it just because it was impassioned. Don't believe it just because it had some facts with it. Just don't believe it because it has come to you. Instead, he says, be prudent here in this verse. It's a word that means to be experienced and careful and well thought out. Shrewd is another use of this word in the Scripture. It's a word that describes someone who is cunning and careful in their thoughts. They think through them. There's some logic applied. They know not to believe a story just because it's the first story, or because it's a loud story, or because it has an air of suspicion to it, or secretiveness to it, or conspiracy to it. The prudent, instead, it says, considers well his steps. He thinks through it. He prays about it. He gets God's perspective on it. And then two things I would say will help us be prudent. The first is this: when you hear a story, think through it, listen to it, and see if you can tell, where does the storyteller want me to go with this? What's the end goal? What's my heart supposed to feel, and what action are you wanting me to take? Sometimes if you'll listen to the story with that intent, you might find some greater clarity. And then also listen to where the story comes from. What kind of heart is it coming from? Is it coming from a heart of hurt? Is it coming from a heart of fear? Is it coming from a heart of anger? Is it coming from a heart of jealousy? However you determine where it comes, or how it's coming from, or the heart it's coming from, and if you can determine where it's wanting you to go, then you will be able to put some perspective into the story. And it might be that you need to hear more of the story, get perspective, get more facts, think through it. Whatever the case, consider your steps well. Consider well what direction your heart will take next, because information does not mean your heart has to act immediately. Let it sit, ponder it, think about it, measure it against God's ways, think about where it came from, think about where it's leading you to. Is it consistent with what God would want you to do? As you do, you'll find greater clarity in what you're hearing, and you'll find greater clarity in the midst of the chaos.